Department of War should be making it clear to potential enemies, that we are strong and we will use that military power and don't screw with us.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end.
The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip. We'll own it. Know that China is doing very poorly right now. I just saw some reports coming out, and I don't want that to happen to China.
You're gambling with World War III.
I was saved by God to make America great again.
I'm Roland Oliphant, and this is Battlelines. It's Friday, the 3rd of October, 2025. This week, US President Donald Trump and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth assembled several hundred of America's top generals and admirals and their senior non-commissioned officers for a very unusual pep talk. Some of the remarks have raised eyebrows. Donald Trump said the Navy needed to bring back battleships. Pete Hegseth chewed out some of the audience for being too fat.
No more beardos. No more identity months, DEI offices, dudes in dresses.
But there were serious points in there. Points about the future culture of the US Armed Forces, its priorities, which Mr. Trump suggested should be focused on the American homeland itself rather than overseas, and points about how and when this administration intends to put to use the most powerful military on the planet.
And we're going to straighten them out one by one. And this is going to be a major part for some of the people in this room. That's a war, too. It's a war from within.
So how much was hot air and how much deadly serious?
We will vanquish every danger and crush every threat to our freedom in every generation to come. Because we will fight, 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 and we will win, win, win.
Who better to ask than someone who knows the US military from the inside? Mark Cancian is a former colonel in the US Marine Corps who now works as senior advisor to the Defense and Security Department at the Center for International and Security Studies, a US defense think tank. I began by asking him for his immediate reaction to Trump and Hegseth's speeches.
My first takeaway was that the dire predictions that many people had made did not occur. That is, because the administration, because Hegseth had not put out an agenda, people were speculating that terrible things might happen, that he might fire a lot of generals, that he might change the oath of office, that he might demand adherence to or support for partisan policies. None of that happened. That said, it was quite an extraordinary event. Hegseth laid out his vision for the department in a way that was quite theatrical. And then the president gave his usual speech, which is a campaign rally with a little about the military.
I'm quite curious about just working through the questions in my own head. The first one, I think it's a question that actually a lot of US service people would want answered, is what's your takeaway about what this means for the four branches, the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, the Marines? If you were a Marine, if you were still a Marine or a serving soldier or airman or sailor, what do you see coming down the line? What does this mean for your job?
Well, first, there's a saying in the Marine Corps, once a Marine, always a Marine. So I'll be a Marine till the day after. There were a couple of messages, although they weren't really new. Hegseth talked about military standards. He talked about grooming. He talked about a focus on warfighting and came back to that theme many times. He talked about excellence and meritocracy. These are themes that he's discussed frequently. And he was quite pejorative about some previous policies. The president talked about his efforts on the border. He talked about his efforts to reduce crime in the cities and how the military would participate in both of those. That's not a surprise, but it is a reinforcement of what has already been put out by the administration.
Digging into what you said about I was watching Hegseth kind of striding about the stage, kind of declaiming like a Shakespearean actor, I suppose. And he made, I mean, perhaps some quite insulting kind of things he said to those senior officers. He said, it's embarrassing to see fat generals and fat admirals. I'm not sure who he was talking about in the audience, or if he singled anybody out. You're all going to have to do twice yearly PT tests. I can do it. You should all be able to do it as well. Things like this. And he also talked about allowing drill sergeants to get more physical with recruits, as he put it, instill a healthy level of fear into recruits, to make sure they are forged. I'm interested in both those things. They're slightly different, but taking the first one, I mean, do you think the senior ranks of the US military have an obesity problem?
I don't know the senior ranks have an obesity problem, but I'm sure that in those hundreds of officers, there are those who are overweight. And I'm sure that many of them went home to their spouses and said, we're going to start eating healthy because I got to lose weight.
Do you think he's right? Do you think there has been a slipping of standards across the board in various places in the US military? Do you think it does need a bit of a kick up the backside?
There's no question that many military officers believe that. They feel that policies that have been implemented over the last really couple of decades have made the military training too easy, have made commanders hesitant to impose standards. When you talk to them personally, you get a lot of complaints about concerns that people are going to lodge anonymous complaints about their conduct or their training standards. So there's no question that will resonate with the senior officers. The focus on war fighting, the effort to give more latitude to commanders, that will resonate. There's no question, though, that Hegseth was very theatrical. You called him maybe a Shakespearean actor. And remember, he was a TV commentator, so that is his background. It's also interesting that his background in the military was as a junior officer. So much of what you're hearing about personal fitness, personal appearance, reflects his experience as a junior officer, because if you are a platoon commander, company commander in the military, you spend a lot of time, keeping the troops in shape, making sure they get haircuts, making sure that, they're fit. And his speech reflects that. It did not have very much about strategy and the kinds of things that he would have discussed if his experience had been at a higher level in the military. It also reflected a very Army combat arms view of the military. And again, because he did not do any what are called joint tours, he never worked with the Air Force or Space Force or the Navy, he didn't really have a sense about what standards are appropriate for them, and are those different from what might be appropriate for Army ground forces.
And I was wondering, on the question of training, he seemed to say that training for recruits has got too soft, and he talked about kind of letting drill sergeants get back to what they do best. And I suppose he painted this image of it sounded to me like the Full Metal Jacket image of the drill sergeant kind of putting these poor kids through hell until in the movie one of them cracks and ends up committing murder and going mad. What's your take on that? I mean, is there a case for returning to a harsher form of training? I mean, has it changed since you joined? What do you make of that?
Many officers believe that is the case, and that boot camp needs to be a tougher experience, more of a rite of passage. When I came in, boot camp was demanding, even brutal. But the drill sergeants were not allowed to hit us. Now, they could make life thoroughly miserable and put us through the ringer, physically extremely demanding, without putting a hand on that. And that's what I worry about here with this guidance to boot camp and drill instructors. That is, you can make boot camp, basic training, much tougher without abusing the recruits, without touching them, without striking them. And I hope that they come to a balance there.
That's interesting. Could you give me some examples? I mean, in what respect do you think that experience has changed over the years? In what respects do you think it's got softer, or maybe even got better for young kind of 18-year-olds joining the Corps and going to Paris Island, whatever?
Well, there are some things in the Marine Corps that are better. Back in the 1990s, they instituted what's called the Crucible. It's a 54-hour final exam in boot camp. The recruits get very little sleep. They do a series of combat problems. They do a lot of physical exercise, a lot of hikes around the base. And at the end of it, there is a ceremony where they get the Marine Corps Eagle, Globe, and Anchor and are called Marines for the first time. That is great. And that was an improvement over when I was in the military. But there's a lot of question about whether having gender integrated boot camps have reduced standards to the lowest common denominator, because the military has to get something like 90% of the troops through boot camp. If they go below that, then they start running into problems with their force. So if you have men and women together, you have to set the physical standards at what the 90th percentile of women can do. And very often that's not demanding enough for men. And that's, I think, the foundation for many of the criticisms about boot camp today, as well as questions about complaints and whether commanders can really hold the troops to high standards.
After the break, should US troops really be deployed on American streets? And what should America's adversaries and allies make of the new Trump Hegseth doctrine? Welcome back.
I wanted to move on slightly to the bigger picture stuff. The most, is amusing the right word, thing. Donald Trump talked about bringing back battleships. Are we bringing back battleships?
No. And I'm sure the Navy is scrambling around all last night trying to figure out how they respond to that. But Trump did spend a lot of time talking about battleships and how they were so great in World War II and how much armor they had and how much he wanted to bring them back. Now, the United States has 8 battleships, but they are all museum ships. And there's no way that we're going to bring them back. So that was one of the amusing moments in the talks. The other one I might add is when President Trump imitated President Obama coming down the White House stairs, and about how President Obama, who's a much younger man, could just amble down the stairs, and how he, as an older guy, he said, "I have to be careful I don't fall. I have to hold the railing."
That's interestingly self-deprecating, coming from Donald Trump. He talked about, as he said, he talked a bit more about the strategy, I suppose, than Pete Hegseth did, and he talked about this priority of defending the homeland, and this comes in parallel with, I'm not sure if we've seen it, but we've definitely seen leaks trailed in the US press, this new Pentagon strategy document, which we believe, once it's published, is going to talk about the absolute priority is the Western Hemisphere. Given everything that's happening, in America, the talk, deployment of the National Guard in cities, Donald Trump talking about, war in Portland and so on. What do you think that really means? And I suppose the upshot is, could it put US servicemen in a slightly awkward position of being used to do, kind of very politically sensitive stuff at home?
Let's start with the question about strategy, because that's a very interesting one. The Pentagon put out an initial strategy back, I think, in March or April, and that was focused entirely on the Pacific. It said that preventing the takeover of Taiwan by China was our driving scenario, that China was the pacing threat, consistent with what the Biden administration had said. But it was focused on China even more and proposed to pull emphasis away from Europe and away from the Middle East. It reflected the views of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, a guy named Bridge Colby. But what we're seeing now is quite different. That is a focus on Homeland Security. People who have read the draft document tell me that half of the new National Defense Strategy is about Homeland Security, and then there's some about China. There's almost nothing about Russia. Now, that's a draft. It might change, but that's a huge change from where the department was in March and April. And it is quite different from the vision that Hegseth laid out. I mean, he laid out a vision of combat with great powers, not walking the streets of U.S. Cities. President Trump, on the other hand, talked a lot about domestic uses of the military, of course, about the cities, and then about the southwest border, a little about counter-drug. And he's implemented a lot of that. You know, there are troops here in Washington, D.C. and Memphis, possibly in Chicago. He said he keeps coming back to that. And, there are some going into Portland. Now, so far, that has been relatively benign. That is hugely controversial from a policy perspective. You know, should we be using military forces in our cities? But what the troops do is relatively benign. That is, they do not do law enforcement. They do not deal directly with the public in terms of arresting people. You know, they've been walking the streets. They've been helping the police. They've even been doing landscaping, which is a running joke here in Washington, D.C. That's fine. You know, I don't believe that that's a really good use of the military, but, you know, it's not the civil military crisis that it might have been. On the other hand, the president had this one line. He said, I told Pete that we should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military National Guard. That's all there was. It was sandwiched between a discussion of the southwest border and then of the cities. And it's the one line I think that every article about the speeches picked up on, and you know, many people expressing concern that start doing combat operations in cities. It doesn't really say that. Not really clear what it means. It could be that the president is expressing his feelings about the subject, that he's trolling his political opponents, as he often does, and that nothing will change. You know, that these deployments will have a training benefit for at least some of the elements, you know, the support elements. On the other hand, it could mean that he is encouraging Secretary Hegseth to begin using lethal force in these cities. That would be both a big change and a huge mistake. The problem is that soldiers are not trained to deal with citizens. They're trained to deal with threats. They don't get the kind of training about citizens' rights and the use of lethal force that police do. A police recruit might get 40 hours of training on citizen rights. The military might get 2. They're just not equipped in training or in orientation, in worldview, to do this kind of job. That's why they've been kept in support tasks so far. You know, that's fine. But if they were authorized to use military force, huge problems. There would be errors. People would get hurt. We'll see how Hegseth implements that. If he just says nothing and just sort of supports the president, you know, yeah, we're going to, you know, fight crime in these cities, great. But if he changes his guidance about the use of force and the rules of engagement, you know, that will be a major issue and I think a major problem.
You mentioned there the shift apparently from the kind of Bridge Colby vision to this much more focused, which I picked up on too. I was speaking to an American journalist who follows this stuff, and he said, look, you know, there's 3 kinds of Republican foreign policy theory. The administration's already basically jettisoned the Reaganite, you know, global dominance idea, and you've now got a debate between the prioritizers, that'd be Bridge Colby, the people who think, you know, we've got to make do with what we got, and China's the big issue, so we're going to focus on that, and what he called the restrainers, people who they kind of feel isolationist is a bit of a slur, but who basically are very, very cautious about getting involved anywhere. I mean, is your sense that the restrainers have won the argument, and that the American military is now, you know, coming back to focus on, I don't know, drug boats in the Gulf of Mexico and things like that?
Rhetorically, there's no question that has happened. You know, President Trump talks about it frequently. In terms of numbers, so far, the numbers have been small. You know, for example, he's sending 200 National Guard to Portland. Now, from a policy point of view, that's huge and has, you know, engendered tremendous debate. In terms of a military that has 2.1 million service members, that's nothing. And in fact, when you add up all of the demands that Trump has put on the force for southwest border, for drug interdiction, for the cities, it's less than 1% of the force. So far, it has not been a major force demand, despite the political importance. That might change. They also might give direction for changing the structure of the military. But as I say, so far, you haven't seen a lot of changes on the ground. In terms of strategy, I would call it America first. I mean, many people do call it restrainers. I think it's a little different. The strategy looks like it will call for hemispheric security and homeland security, a little broader maybe than just restraint. And we've seen instances where the president has been willing to use force overseas. So, how that will play out, whether that will be a rhetorical change or whether it will be a major change in forces, we'll see when the document comes out.
Thank you, Mark. Lastly, I was wondering if I could ask you to kind of perform, a bit of a thought experiment, a phenomenological reduction, which is the fancy way of saying kind of put yourself in somebody else's shoes. The US military deals with two kinds of other militaries. It deals with allies, people who have to work with them, and enemies, people who they fight. What do you think those two categories of people, I don't know, will or should be taking away from yesterday's speech?
There wasn't really much about allies and partners. So for them, I would say, watch what the strategy document says. There was some, Trump talked about, Europeans paying more. There's been a lot of discussion about that. But didn't make any announcements about, pulling out of NATO or turning NATO over to the Europeans, NATO command. In terms of our adversaries, I think that they might have listened to what Hegseth said with a bit of concern. That is, Hegseth said, you take us on, we're going to crush you. Well, I hope President Xi was listening to that because, that's what deterrence is made of. I have received some questions about, is that too warlike? And my response is, no, this is what you want the Department of War to be saying. It's not what you want the Department of State to be saying. You want them to be doing diplomacy. But the Department of War should be making it clear to potential enemies, that we are strong and we will use that military power and don't screw with us.
You've been listening to the former US Marine officer Mark Cancian. That's all for today. We'll be back on Monday. Until then, that was Battlelines. Goodbye.
Battlelines is an original podcast from The Telegraph created by David Knowles. If you appreciated this show, please consider following Battlelines on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review as it helps others find the show. To stay on top of all our news, subscribe to The Telegraph, sign on to our Dispatches newsletter, or listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine for Latest. You can also get in touch directly by emailing battlelines@telegraph.co.uk or contact us on X. You can find our handles in the show notes. This episode of Battlelines was hosted by me, Roland Oliphant, and produced by Max Bauer. The executive producer is Louisa Wells.